In the heart of a quaint Texas town, Brian and Grace Davis appeared to have the perfect life. But beneath the surface of their 20-year marriage lay secrets that would soon shatter their world. Join us as we dive into Betrayal and Redemption, the journey of a cheating wife and a husband's resolve. This gripping tale of love, betrayal, and the arduous path to forgiveness explores the depths of human emotions and the power of second chances. Stay tuned as we unravel the story of Brian and Grace, where the road to healing is fraught with challenges but fueled by an unwavering determination to rebuild what was lost. Brian sat on the porch of his quaint house in the small Texas town, sipping on a glass of sweet tea. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow across the neatly kept lawn. The air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers and freshly cut grass, a typical summer evening in June. He watched as the neighbors went about their routines, some walking their dogs, others chatting casually by the fence. This was home, a place of peace and familiarity, or so he thought. Brian had been a police officer for over 20 years, a job that had its fair share of ups and downs. He had faced dangerous situations, made tough decisions, and seen the darker side of humanity. But through it all, he had always had Grace by his side. They had met in high school, where Grace's passion for cooking had already begun to blossom. She was known for bringing delicious homemade treats to school events, and it was at one such event that Brian had fallen for her charm and her culinary skills. Their relationship had been the epitome of young love, filled with dreams and plans for the future. After high school, Brian had pursued his career in law enforcement, while Grace had taken on various catering jobs and freelance projects. Her flexible schedule allowed her to be a devoted mother to their two daughters, Samantha and Madison. Brian often thought of himself as incredibly lucky to have such a supportive and loving family. Samantha, their eldest, had recently graduated from college and was working in Houston, a few hours away. Madison, the younger of the two, was in her junior year at Texas A&M University. Both girls were exceptional in their own ways, a testament to Grace's dedication and love as a mother. Their absence from the home had left a noticeable void, but Brian and Grace had managed to fill it with their shared activities and long conversations. Despite the strong bond they shared, there had always been one area of their relationship that lacked fulfillment: their sex life. In the early years of their marriage, their physical connection had been passionate and frequent. But over time, Grace's interest in intimacy had waned. Brian had initially brushed it off, attributing it to the stresses of raising children and managing a household. However, as the years passed, the frequency of their intimate moments had dwindled to once every 10 days, sometimes even less. Brian had tried to address the issue multiple times, suggesting they see a family psychologist, which they did. The sessions had helped to some extent, with the counselor advising Grace on the importance of maintaining physical intimacy in their marriage. Things had improved slightly, but not enough to satisfy Brian's needs. He had learned to cope with the situation, finding solace in other aspects of their relationship. This evening, as Brian sat on the porch, he couldn't shake off the feeling that something was amiss. Grace was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, her silhouette visible through the window. She was humming softly, a habit she had when she was content. Yet, there was a nagging thought in the back of Brian's mind, a sense of unease that he couldn't quite place. "Brian, dinner's ready," Grace called out from the kitchen. "Be right there," Brian replied, setting his glass down and heading inside. The kitchen smelled heavenly, filled with the aroma of Grace's famous pot roast. Brian took his seat at the dining table, where Grace had already set out the plates and silverware. She joined him, placing the dish in the center of the table with a smile. "Everything looks delicious, as always," Brian said, reaching for the serving spoon. "Thank you, dear. I hope you like it," Grace replied, sitting down across from him. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, exchanging occasional comments about their day. Grace talked about her latest catering project, while Brian shared stories from the precinct. It was a typical evening, yet Brian couldn't shake the feeling of unease. "Is everything okay, Brian? You seem a bit distracted," Grace asked, her eyes filled with concern. Brian hesitated for a moment before answering. "I'm fine, just thinking about some things at work." Nothing to worry about. Grace reached across the table, placing her hand on his. You know you can talk to me about anything, right? I know, Grace. It's just been a long day, Brian replied, squeezing her hand gently. After dinner, they settled into their usual routine. Brian watched a football game on TV, while Grace cleaned up the kitchen and then joined him on the couch. They sat together, Grace leaning against Brian, her head resting on his shoulder. It was moments like these that Brian cherished the most, the quiet companionship they shared. As the evening progressed, Brian's thoughts continued to wander. He wondered if their relationship would ever return to the passionate days of their youth. He missed the intimacy they once had, but he also valued the deep emotional connection they had built over the years. Despite the challenges, he loved Grace with all his heart. Do you remember our first date? Brian asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Grace looked up at him, her eyes sparkling with nostalgia. Of course I do. You took me to that little diner by the lake. We talked for hours. Brian smiled. I knew from that moment that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with you. Grace smiled back, a hint of sadness in her eyes. We've had some wonderful times together, haven't we? Yes, we have, Brian agreed, pulling her closer. They stayed like that for a while, lost in their memories. Eventually, Grace got up and announced she was going to bed. Brian followed shortly after, slipping into bed beside her. He reached out to hold her, but she turned away, muttering something about being tired. Brian sighed, feeling the familiar pang of disappointment. Good night, Grace, he whispered. Good night, Brian, she replied softly. Brian lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling. The sense of unease from earlier had returned, stronger than before. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but he didn't know what. As he finally drifted off to sleep, he hoped that the next day would bring some clarity. Little did he know, his world was about to be turned upside down. The next morning, Brian awoke to the smell of fresh coffee and bacon. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft, orange hue across the bedroom. Grace was already up, bustling around in the kitchen, her cheerful humming floating through the house. It was a Saturday, and Brian had the day off, a rare occurrence that he cherished. He planned to spend it working on some projects around the house and perhaps taking Grace out for dinner. As he made his way downstairs, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had lingered from the night before. He tried to push it aside, reminding himself that today was meant to be a day of relaxation and quality time with Grace. Morning, sweetheart, Grace greeted him with a warm smile as he entered the kitchen. She was flipping pancakes, her hair pulled back into a loose ponytail. I made your favorite breakfast. Good morning, Grace, Brian replied, forcing a smile. It smells amazing in here. They sat down to eat, chatting about the plans for the day. Grace mentioned needing to run a few errands, while Brian talked about fixing the broken fence in the backyard. It was a typical, pleasant morning, but the sense of unease persisted, gnawing at the back of Brian's mind. After breakfast, Grace left to run her errands, leaving Brian alone in the house. He decided to tackle the fence repair first, hoping some physical labor would clear his mind. As he worked, he couldn't stop thinking about the man he had seen leaving their house the day before. Who was he? And why had he been there? The questions nagged at him, refusing to be ignored. Brian decided to take a break and go inside to get some water. As he walked through the living room, he noticed something unusual. The front door, which he distinctly remembered locking, was slightly ajar. Brian's heart skipped a beat. He quickly checked the house, finding nothing out of place. However, the sense of unease grew stronger. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Determined to find answers, Brian decided to check the home security camera footage. He had installed cameras around the house a few years ago, mainly as a precautionary measure. He pulled up the footage on his laptop and began to review it. As Brian fast-forwarded through the previous day's footage, his heart raced. There it was, clear as day, the man he had seen leaving the house. Brian paused the video, zooming in on the man's face. It was Ethan Carter, a neighbor who lived a few blocks away. Brian knew Ethan as a friendly, helpful guy who worked as a freelance computer technician. But what was he doing in their house? Brian continued to watch the footage, his eyes glued to the screen. He saw Ethan enter the house at around 11:30 a.m., the time when Grace was supposed to be at home. The footage showed Ethan walking around the house, heading upstairs, and then emerging half an hour later, looking disheveled. The pieces began to fall into place, and a sickening realization hit Brian like a punch to the gut. He felt a surge of anger and betrayal. How could Grace do this to him? They had been married for over 20 years, built a life together, and raised 2 wonderful daughters. The thought of her being unfaithful was unbearable. Determined to get to the bottom of this, Brian decided to confront Ethan. He needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. He grabbed his car keys and drove to Ethan's house, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. When he arrived, he saw Ethan's car parked in the driveway. Brian took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. After a few moments, Ethan opened the door, looking surprised and a bit apprehensive. "Brian, what are you doing here?" Ethan asked, trying to sound casual. "We need to talk, Ethan," Brian replied, his voice cold and steady. "Can I come in?" Ethan hesitated for a moment before stepping aside to let Brian in. They walked into the living room, where Brian turned to face Ethan, his expression hard and unforgiving. "I saw you leaving my house yesterday," Brian began, his voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "What the hell were you doing there?" Ethan's face paled, and he took a step back. "Brian, I can explain." "Start explaining," Brian interrupted, his fists clenched at his sides. "And it better be the truth." Ethan took a deep breath, clearly struggling to find the right words. "Look, Brian, I never meant for any of this to happen. Grace and we've been seeing each other for a couple of months now. It started out innocent, but things just escalated." Brian felt his world shatter at Ethan's words. He fought to keep his composure, but the betrayal cut deep. "How could you? How could she?" he demanded, his voice breaking. "I don't know, Brian. It just happened," Ethan replied, looking genuinely remorseful. "She was unhappy, and I guess I was there at the right, or wrong, time." Brian couldn't listen to any more. He turned and stormed out of the house, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He needed to confront Grace, to hear her side of the story, and to understand why she had done this to him. Brian drove home, his anger simmering just below the surface. When he arrived, he saw Grace's car in the driveway. He took a moment to compose himself before entering the house. Grace was in the kitchen, putting away groceries, when he walked in. "Grace, we need to talk," Brian said, his voice tight with emotion. Grace turned to him, a look of concern on her face. "Brian, what's wrong?" "I know about you and Ethan," Brian said, cutting straight to the point. Grace's face went pale, and she took a step back, her eyes wide with shock and guilt. "Brian, how long has this been going on?" Brian demanded, his voice rising. "How could you do this to me? To us?" Tears welled up in Grace's eyes as she tried to find the words. "Brian, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. It started a few months ago. I was feeling lonely and, I don't know, vulnerable. Ethan was there, and things just happened." Brian's heart ached with betrayal. "Why, Grace? Why didn't you come to me? We could have worked through this together." "I didn't know how to, Brian," Grace sobbed. "I was afraid of how you would react, and I didn't want to burden you with my feelings. I know I made a terrible mistake, and I regret it more than anything." Brian looked at her, feeling a mix of anger, sadness, and a deep sense of loss. "We need to figure out where we go from here, Grace. I don't know if I can ever trust you again." Grace nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand, Brian. I just want you to know that I love you, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." Brian turned away, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. He knew their relationship would never be the same, and the road ahead would be a long and difficult one. But for the sake of their family, he was willing to try and find a way to move forward. The days following Brian's confrontation with Ethan were a whirlwind of emotions. Brian felt like he was living in a nightmare, struggling to come to terms with Grace's betrayal. He spent most of his time at home, avoiding his colleagues and friends, unable to face their questions or pity. He couldn't shake the image of Ethan leaving his house, and Grace's tearful confession echoed in his mind. Grace, on the other hand, tried her best to make amends. She cooked Brian's favorite meals, kept the house spotless, and attempted to engage him in conversations. But Brian's responses were curt and cold, his anger simmering just below the surface. Grace knew she had shattered his trust, and the guilt weighed heavily on her. One morning, as Brian was sipping his coffee and staring blankly out the window, his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Brian, it's Michael. We need to talk. Can you meet me at the park at noon?" Brian's heart skipped a beat. Michael Harris was another man Grace had mentioned in her confession. Brian knew he couldn't avoid this confrontation forever. He replied with a simple, "Okay," and glanced at the clock. It was 10:30 a.m. He had an hour and a half to prepare himself mentally for what was sure to be a difficult conversation. At noon, Brian arrived at the park. It was a sunny day, and the park was filled with families enjoying picnics and children playing on the playground. Brian spotted Michael sitting on a bench near the lake, looking anxious. Brian approached him, his steps heavy with dread. "Michael," he greeted, his voice flat. "Brian," Michael replied, standing up and extending his hand. Brian hesitated for a moment before shaking it, then sat down beside him. "I know why you're here," Brian began, cutting straight to the point. "I want to hear it from you. How long have you been seeing Grace?" Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's been about 8 months. It started last fall." Brian felt a surge of anger. 8 months? How could you do this to me, Michael? We've been friends for years. "I know, Brian, and I hate myself for it. Grace and we got too close. It started as just friendly conversations, and then it became something more. I tried to resist, but she was persistent." Brian clenched his fists, struggling to keep his temper in check. "Why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you stop it?" "I was weak, Brian. I knew it was wrong, but I let it happen. I regret it every single day," Michael admitted, his voice filled with remorse. Brian took a deep breath, trying to process Michael's words. "Did you ever think about what this would do to our families? To Laura and the kids?" "Of course I did," Michael replied, his eyes filled with guilt. "But by the time I realized the full extent of what I was doing, it was too late. I tried to end it, but Grace wouldn't let go." Brian's mind raced, filled with conflicting emotions. He had trusted Michael, considered him a friend, and now he felt utterly betrayed. "I don't know how to move forward from this, Michael. You've destroyed my trust in both of you." "I understand, Brian. If there's anything I can do to make it right, please let me know," Michael said, his voice pleading. Brian stood up, his heart heavy. "I don't know if there's anything you can do. But I appreciate your honesty." Michael nodded, looking defeated. "I'm sorry, Brian. Truly, I am." Brian walked away, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He knew he needed to confront Grace again, to understand why she had done this and to decide what their future would be. When Brian returned home, Grace was in the kitchen, preparing lunch. She looked up as he entered, her face a mask of worry. "Brian, where have you been?" "I met with Michael," Brian replied, his voice cold. Grace's face paled. "Oh, Brian, I'm so sorry." "Why, Grace? Why did you do it?" Brian demanded, his voice rising with anger. 8 months with Michael? And Ethan? How many more were there? Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Brian, please, let me explain." "Explain? What is there to explain? You've been cheating on me for months, with multiple men," Brian shouted, his frustration boiling over. Grace broke down, sobbing. "I was lonely, Brian. You were always busy with work, and I felt neglected. I know that's no excuse, but I needed someone to talk to, someone who made me feel wanted." Brian's anger began to give way to a deep sadness. "And you couldn't talk to me? We've been married for over 20 years, Grace. We've faced so much together. Why didn't you come to me?" "I was afraid, Brian," Grace admitted, her voice trembling. "I didn't want to burden you with my feelings. I thought I could handle it on my own, but I was wrong. And once it started, I didn't know how to stop." Brian sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you, Grace. You've shattered my trust. Grace knelt beside him, her tears falling onto his hands. I understand, Brian. But I love you, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right. Please, give me a chance to prove it to you. Brian looked into her eyes, seeing the pain and regret there. He knew that the road to forgiveness would be long and difficult, but for the sake of their family, he was willing to try. All right, Grace. We'll try to work through this. But it's going to take time. Grace nodded, her relief palpable. Thank you, Brian. I'll do whatever it takes to earn back your trust. In the days that followed, Brian and Grace began the slow process of rebuilding their relationship. They attended couples counseling, where they could openly discuss their feelings and work on their issues. It wasn't easy, and there were many moments of anger and tears, but they were committed to making it work. Brian struggled with his feelings of betrayal, but he also began to understand Grace's perspective. He realized that he had been so focused on his work that he had neglected her emotional needs. It didn't excuse her actions, but it helped him see the bigger picture. Grace, for her part, worked hard to regain Brian's trust. She was transparent about her activities, constantly checking in with him and reassuring him of her love. She also sought individual counseling to address her own issues and learn how to communicate better with Brian. One evening, a few months after the confrontation, Brian and Grace sat on the porch, watching the sunset. The tension between them had lessened, replaced by a tentative sense of hope. Do you remember our first date? Brian asked, breaking the silence. Grace smiled, her eyes shining with nostalgia. Yes, I do. We went to that little diner by the lake. We talked for hours. Brian nodded, reaching for her hand. We've come a long way since then, haven't we? We have, Grace agreed, squeezing his hand. And we've faced many challenges together. This is just another one we'll overcome. Brian looked at her, seeing the woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago. Despite everything, he still loved her, and he was determined to make their marriage work. I believe we can, Grace. I really do. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon. It was a small step, but it was a step towards healing and rebuilding their life together. The summer days in Texas were long and hot, and the tension in the Davis household matched the sweltering heat. Brian and Grace had made a commitment to rebuild their relationship, but the road ahead was fraught with challenges. The wounds of betrayal were still fresh, and the path to healing was anything but smooth. Brian continued to work on repairing the broken fence in their backyard. The physical labor was therapeutic, giving him a chance to clear his mind and work through his anger. Meanwhile, Grace focused on maintaining the household and making small gestures to show her commitment to their reconciliation. She cooked Brian's favorite meals, left sweet notes in his lunchbox, and made an effort to be more present and attentive. Despite these efforts, there were days when the weight of their problems felt unbearable. Brian struggled with feelings of mistrust, and Grace grappled with guilt and regret. They had started attending couples counseling, but progress was slow, and each session brought new revelations and emotions to the surface. Their first counseling session was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon. Brian and Grace arrived at the therapist's office, both feeling a mix of anxiety and hope. Dr. Laura Stevens, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a calming presence, greeted them warmly. Welcome, Brian and Grace. I'm glad you've decided to take this step, Dr. Stevens said, motioning for them to sit on the comfortable chairs in her office. Why don't we start by each of you sharing what brought you here today? Brian looked at Grace, then back at Dr. Stevens. We've been married for over 20 years, but recently I discovered that Grace has been unfaithful, he began, his voice tight with emotion. We want to work through this, but it's been incredibly difficult. Grace nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. I made a terrible mistake, and I regret it deeply. I love Brian and want to make things right, but I know I've hurt him badly. Dr. Stevens listened intently, her expression compassionate. Thank you for sharing that. It's clear that both of you are in a lot of pain. My goal here is to help you navigate these feelings and find a way to move forward. It's going to take time and effort from both of you. Brian and Grace both nodded, eager to start the healing process but unsure of what to expect. As the sessions progressed, they delved deeper into the issues that had led to Grace's infidelity. Grace admitted to feeling neglected and unappreciated, emotions that had festered over the years as Brian became more absorbed in his work. She confessed that her actions were a misguided attempt to fill the void she felt. Brian, in turn, acknowledged that he had taken Grace for granted. He had assumed that their marriage was solid and that Grace was content. The realization that he had contributed to her feelings of loneliness was a bitter pill to swallow. "It's important to remember that both of you have played a role in where you are now," Dr. Stevens said during one session. "Blame isn't helpful. What matters is how you move forward and what changes you can make to prevent this from happening again." Rebuilding trust was one of the biggest hurdles they faced. Brian found it hard to shake off the images of Grace with other men, and he struggled with feelings of inadequacy and betrayal. He constantly questioned her actions and whereabouts, a behavior that Grace understood but found exhausting. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Brian finally voiced his fears. "I want to trust you again, Grace, but it's so hard. Every time you leave the house, I can't help but wonder where you're going and who you're with." Grace reached for his hand, her eyes filled with tears. "I know, Brian. And I understand why you feel that way. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to rebuild your trust. If you need to call or text me when I'm out, do it. If you need to know my schedule, I'll share it with you. I have nothing to hide." Brian nodded, appreciating her willingness to be transparent. "I don't want to be a controlling husband, but I need some reassurance right now." "I get it," Grace said softly. "And I'm here for you. We'll get through this together." As the weeks turned into months, Brian and Grace began to find a new rhythm in their relationship. They made a conscious effort to spend more quality time together, rekindling the spark that had brought them together in the first place. They took long walks in the park, cooked dinner together, and even planned a weekend getaway to reconnect. One Saturday morning, Brian surprised Grace with breakfast in bed. He had made her favorite pancakes with fresh berries and whipped cream. As she sat up in bed, looking at the tray with a mixture of surprise and delight, Brian felt a glimmer of hope. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, handing her a cup of coffee. "Good morning," Grace replied, smiling. "This is such a wonderful surprise." "Thank you." Brian sat on the edge of the bed, watching her take a bite of the pancake. "I know we've been through a lot, but I want you to know that I'm committed to making this work. I love you, Grace." Tears welled up in Grace's eyes as she reached out to touch his hand. "I love you too, Brian. More than anything. And I'm so grateful for another chance." They shared a tender moment, the first in a long time, and it felt like a small but significant step towards healing. Despite the progress they were making, Brian and Grace knew that their journey was far from over. The scars of betrayal would take time to heal, and they both needed to remain vigilant and committed to their relationship. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Grace brought up a difficult topic. "Brian, I've been thinking a lot about our future. I know we've been focusing on healing and rebuilding trust, but I think it's also important to set some goals for ourselves." Brian looked at her, curious. "What kind of goals?" Grace took a deep breath. "I want us to continue counseling, even after things start to feel better. I think it's important to have that support. And I also want us to make time for each other, no matter how busy life gets. We need to prioritize our relationship." Brian nodded, appreciating her honesty. "I agree. We can't let things slip back to how they were. We need to keep working on this, together." Grace smiled, relieved. "Thank you, Brian. I also want us to find new ways to connect, whether it's taking up a hobby together or planning regular date nights. We need to keep the spark alive." "I'm all for that," Brian said, smiling back. "We've come a long way, Grace. And I believe we can make it through this, as long as we stick together." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars twinkle in the night sky. It was a moment of peace, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was always hope. As Brian and Grace worked on their marriage, they also had to consider the impact on their daughters, Samantha and Madison. They had decided to keep the details of the infidelity private, but the tension between their parents was noticeable. One weekend, Samantha came home for a visit. She had sensed that something was wrong during their last phone call, and she wanted to check in on her parents. As she sat in the living room, sipping tea, she decided to confront them. "Mom, Dad, I've noticed that things have been a bit tense around here lately," Samantha began, looking at them with concern. "Is everything okay?" Brian and Grace exchanged a glance, silently agreeing that it was time to be honest with their daughter. "Samantha, there's something we need to tell you," Brian said, taking a deep breath. "Your mother and I have been going through a rough patch. We're working on it, but it hasn't been easy." Grace reached for Samantha's hand, her eyes filled with tears. "We want you to know that we love each other and we're committed to making things work. But there have been some challenges." Samantha listened intently, her heart aching for her parents. "I'm so sorry to hear that. I just want you both to be happy. If there's anything I can do to help, please let me know." "Thank you, sweetheart," Brian said, feeling a surge of pride for his daughter's maturity. "Just knowing that you're here for us means a lot." As the months went by, the Davis family began to find a new sense of normalcy. The wounds of betrayal were still there, but they were slowly healing. Brian and Grace continued their counseling sessions, both individually and as a couple, and they made a conscious effort to communicate openly and honestly. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Brian felt a sense of hope that he hadn't felt in a long time. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the landscape, and the air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers. "Grace, I've been thinking," Brian began, turning to face her. "I know we've been through a lot, but I believe that we can come out of this stronger. We've faced so many challenges together, and we've always found a way to overcome them." Grace smiled, her eyes filled with love. "I believe that too, Brian. We've come a long way, and I'm so grateful for another chance to make things right." Brian took her hand, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. "We're going to be okay, Grace. As long as we have each other, we can get through anything." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars twinkle in the night sky. It was a moment of peace, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was always hope. The journey of reconciliation was far from over, but Brian and Grace were committed to making it work. They had faced the depths of betrayal and emerged with a renewed sense of purpose and love. The road ahead would be challenging, but with open communication, trust, and unwavering support for each other, they were ready to face whatever came their way. In the end, it was their love and determination that would see them through, proving that even the deepest wounds could heal with time, effort, and a lot of heart. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey through Betrayal and Redemption. The journey of a cheating wife and a husband's resolve. Brian and Grace's story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. As they navigate the painful process of rebuilding trust and finding forgiveness, their unwavering commitment to each other shines through. Remember, every relationship faces challenges, and it's the effort to overcome them that truly defines us. If Brian and Grace's journey has inspired you or resonated with your own experiences, please share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more heartfelt stories and explorations of life's most profound moments. Until next time, may you find the strength and courage to face your own challenges and the hope to rebuild and renew your relationships. Thank you for watching, and God bless.